Controlling the world and dictating direction is fun. Simulations are games. This isn't a profound statement today. In the 1980s, it broke new ground. For the first decades of PC gaming, developer Sid Meier had been forging a path. Civilization was his magnum opus, which went a very long way to forging the landscape of PC and console gaming. Even though he is most closely identified with the turn-based masterpiece Civilization today, he got started on military flight simulators, which gamified computer-simulated flight in a way that segment dominator Microsoft did not. Reach for the Stars was a science fiction strategy computer game. It is the earliest known commercially published example of the 4X genre. The early game was developed by Roger Keating and Ian Trout of SSG of Australia and published in 1983 for the Commodore 64 and then Apple in 1985. Versions for Mac OS, Amiga, Apple IIgs, and DOS were released in 1988. The player commands a home star in the galaxy and then expands to form an interstellar empire by colonizing far-off worlds, building powerful starships, and researching new technologies. Reach for the Stars was very strongly influenced by the board game Stellar Conquest. Many of RFTS's features were copied into Stellar Conquest. Stellar Conquest was a board game released in the early 80s. It was highly influential in creating and popularizing conventions within the strategy and 4X genre. The tactical and strategic elements provide countless rich combinations in Reach for the Stars for colony development and interstellar warfare. The software's AI also offered a challenging opponent in single-player games. It is not uncommon for a Reach for the Stars game to take over 12 hours to complete in single-player mode and 24 hours with multiple players. The term 4X traces its origins to Alan Emmerich, describing Master of Orion for computer gaming world. It was a takeoff of spicy entertainment. In his review, Emmerich went on to discuss strategy games that put a great emphasis on exploring territory, their expanding borders, exploiting resources, and exterminating the competition instead of strategy games that emphasize strict management of units and buildings. The four attributes he describes in his review are explore, expand, exploit, exterminate, the terms from which the name 4X originates. Oddly enough, Alan Emmerich would go on to become the lead designer of Master of Orion 3, and in that game Emmerich extolled how it was a 5X game by adding experience as a significant gameplay component. While the four parts of 4X are easy to describe, the genre itself is more ambiguous. Many strategy games feature the 4X's, but are not necessarily considered 4X games. Beyond the 4X's, games in the 4X genre are noted for their complexity, allowing players to manage their empire's government, economy, diplomacy, research, and technology. Similarly, most 4X games utilize multiple interface screens and stat sheets. Sid Meier reflected in his book Sid Meier's Memoir that when he started his career in gaming, it was very different. It was mostly hobbyists and shareware. Shareware was distributed through gaming magazines at least the first few levels. If the player liked them, they had to write away to the designer and request the game, offering them a few dollars. When Sid Meier got into gaming as a profession, it wasn't a viable profession even for a few. Everything changed, however, with a legendary meeting with a fellow coworker named Bill Steely. Steely was brash where Sid Meier was reserved. He was a consummate salesman who got Microprose more than just off the ground. He made them successful. Microprose games were more complicated than standard arcade games of the day. Therefore, the shareware model was not viable. That forced Microprose to be much more professional. It also forced Microprose to become a presence in mom-and-pop computer stores. That was Bill Steely's job, to drum up interest in computer games. After that fateful meeting, they want to go play video games after talking to a few bosses in Las Vegas. Bill was amazed at Sid's higher score, to which Sid replied that he picked out the bugs in the game. He said he could make a better game in 2 weeks. And so with less than $2,000, the two men started the company Microprose in Bill Steely's basement. Mr. Meier picked the name Microprose because he was making a statement that games could be important like literature. It is very important to remember that at this time, computer games were still seen as a passing fad for boys. Meier always felt that computer games were as important as literature. And so it was that Sid and Bill entered into an entirely new world. A world they didn't even know was possible. Professional game design. Not done as a hobby, but a career. Don't forget to like and subscribe. For Sid and Bill, that new world was very slow. Bill Steely made the initial sales when he traveled on business for General Instrument. Each individual copy that Steely sold had to be copied from the original floppy using file copy commands by Sid back in Michigan. The process took 10 minutes a disc. Bill sold the game Hellcat Ace to software stores as he traveled on business. Microprose's first game was a World War I flight simulator. It was released to the Atari computer and the Commodore 64 in 1983. It was released to the PC in 1984. It had also taken significantly longer than the 2 weeks Sid had initially said he could make it in back in the Las Vegas arcade. Game software in the 1980s was still largely a hobby. Shareware was very common in the early 80s. Shareware was the practice of giving away the beginning levels of a game, but publishers, such as Microprose, wanted a full release. Unlike simpler arcade-style or episodic games, Microprose produced large-scale simulations and strategy titles. These games relied on long-term engagement, deep systems, and significant manual support. Manuals at that time often served as lore dumps and were very much part of the game itself. The early 80s were growing yet lean years for Microprose. Sid Meier essentially was working two jobs, splitting his time between General Instrument and his new company. He remembers using some of the techniques around hardware architecture that he was learning with things like the Atari computer, with General Instrument cash register software. His bosses at General Instrument were supportive, and many of his coworkers were rooting for him, not least because they wanted to work at Microprose making games. He hired on extra programming help from General Instrument to help with porting the games he was creating to the Commodore 64. He remembers not liking the porting work because it wasn't interesting and didn't help him solve new problems or come up with new solutions around programming. Bill started selling Microprose games on General Instrument sales trips from the road. Later, while working full-time for Microprose, Bill would call up stores pretending to be interested in the games before calling in his real voice to sell those stores those games. People would usually realize that Bill was the one that would call to drum up interest in Microprose games pretty quickly. But they didn't mind because the games were good, and they would sell. In fact, some of those people that he initially tricked into buying the games would be some of his most loyal customers. Because Sid was splitting time between Microprose and General Instrument, he was getting much better at programming. When he learned a new trick through programming, he would implement it in new games. Sometimes he would design a game completely around a new trick that he had learned, such as four-way scrolling or additional character animations found in Floyd of the Jungle. His take on the Donkey Kong platformer genre, mixed with memories of Saturday mornings watching things like George of the Jungle and Tarzan. Floyd of the Jungle was popular with stores because employees would crowd around Bill as he showed it off, and Bill would hand over the controller, and as soon as he did, the employees would have a great deal of fun with the game, thus ensuring the mom-and-pop owner of the software store would purchase copies of Floyd of the Jungle. The game was also innovative in how it implemented multiplayer scenarios, meaning people would buy it because it was not just a solo playing experience. The Civilization franchise of games at the writing of this episode on the Metallic Penguin channel is 35 years old. Its original publisher Microprose and its original developer Sid Meier created an iconic game in far more ways than I could possibly go over in the time I have allotted for this episode. Civilization was one of the first God games ever created. The opening cinematic for the game literally went over the creation of the planet from dust. The opening scene in the game, something that has been more or less replicated across all 7 of the entries, is iconic not just in computer games but in popular culture. In the beginning, you see a tiny stagecoach icon surrounded by an inky blackness of a cathode ray screen. It's only when you move that the fog of war begins to dissipate. This is an effect that has been dialogued with by countless 4X games ever since. Civilization might not be the first game to use the map of a world, as any Civ player knows. You don't necessarily have to start on planet Earth. In fact, most don't. However, it is the most iconic early game that did so. The player essentially takes an empire from the initial settlers in a completely unfamiliar land to the dawn of colonization of other worlds. At the writing of this episode, there are many other games that kind of do what Civilization does. 1 or 2 are almost a direct copy, with the exception of the addition of a wrinkle or two, just to differentiate it, if not in the marketplace, in the courtroom. In his book, Sid Meier's Memoir, Mr. Meier recounts how he was the only child of Swiss and Dutch parents living in Michigan. There was a summer going into a fall term where he was living in the small town his father was from in Switzerland. While there, he became enamored with trains, specifically how the trains ran on time in Switzerland. The fact that the train was never late always intrigued him. I wonder as I play Civilization if the fact that the Swiss trains always running on time had a great impact on the organizational aspects of any well-run empire in the game of Civilization. After all, if you don't run your empire well in this game, your chances of success are greatly reduced. Sid Meier said in a 2003 interview, "Most of my game ideas trace back to my childhood, to things that I became fascinated with at some point during my childhood. Pirates, airplanes, trains, history, and the Civil War were all interests of mine at one time or another. In starting a design, I focus on two key moments. The first time a player starts the game, he or she needs to be quickly drawn into the game. At the end of the game, the player should have a sense of having come a long way since the beginning to a satisfying conclusion and be tempted to play again." In the interview with Game Developer magazine, Mr. Myers shows the reasoning behind something every Civilization player has known for over 30 years. The reason we like the beginning of a Civilization game is because he designed his game in such a way that the beginning draws you in. It's no accident or coincidence at all that so many of us will restart again the next day just to get that feeling of being drawn in and immersed in a new world. 1989 was a very important year for the game Civilization. Several elements came together that year. Will Wright had spent years trying to convince publishers that his City God game with no end and no real objective was a game at all. Nobody believed him. No one wanted to publish it. So in around February of 1989, a game that had been as much an urban myth to many people as a game came into the world. The first platform it was available on, Macintosh. Sid Meier remembers that the game had been ported to PC later in 1989, and that's when he played it for the first time after hearing about it for years. He immediately started forming the edges of an idea around another God game where you control a civilization. Meier has said that SimCity changed the world of computer games. By 1989, Sid Meier had reached the cadence of one game a year at least. He was senior vice president at Microprose while Bill Steely was the president. Bill was in charge of corporate decisions, and Sid Meier was allowed to pretty much create the action games that he wanted to create. Bill had made the decision to bring third-party games into the Microprose stable. Microprose had also opened a London office with 30 employees. In practice, they were equals. Bill had created Microplay to publish the third-party studio's products. It allowed Sid Meier to create action-adventure games and basically took the military titles off of his plate. In 1989, Sid Meier pitched the game Covert Action as Sid Meier's Pirates, but with spies. One of the most important innovations in gaming, especially in 4X gaming, is the tech tree. The tech tree was invented to simplify the acquisition of technology in Civilization. It started out life as a flowchart developed by Sid Meier as a way for him to conceptualize which technologies would lead to which other technologies. Tech trees have been adapted since then by a wide variety of games to varying degrees of success. Sid Meier liked it because it gamified the acquisition of technology, simplifying progression in the game in a fun and exciting way for the player. In 1989, Sid Meier pitched the game Covert Action as Sid Meier's Pirates but with spies. His code designer on Covert Action had previously worked as a board game designer at the company Avalon Hill. That is important because Avalon Hill would put out Civilization as a board game. The designer's name was Bruce Shilley. Bruce's role at first was to help Sid figure out what this spy game was supposed to be. Meier had the idea to come up with different missions for replayability using procedural generation. Meier did not quite know how to make a fun and interesting game about spies. He wanted to drop it, except he felt the responsibility of the company and also of his friends and colleagues, Bill and Bruce. He went on vacation. On vacation, he had come up with Railroad Tycoon, a classic game in its own right. The combination of the simulation behind Railroad Tycoon, the idea to turn Covert Action into a turn-based game, and probably most importantly, Will Wright's SimCity released in '89, are what led to Civilization. Sid Meier began Civilization after he had completed the game Railroad Tycoon. Railroad Tycoon was the first of its kind in terms of being a railroad management simulation. It was far more successful than the board of Microprose had thought. Traveling to New York City via train with his co-developer on Railroad Tycoon, they almost jokingly came up with the brief idea of creating a game bigger than a game about the history of railroads, a game about civilization. He liked working with his co-developer, and that's why he was so quick to come up with a new project for them to work on. Forcing covert action into more of a turn-based game and also emphasizing the strategy elements proved to be the breakthrough Meyer needed for Civilization. Meyer was watching the Indianapolis 500 after the birth of his child and was thinking of all of the different strategy elements that someone could put in a computer game about racing. He saw a way for the turn-based gameplay to be exciting. It could be exciting because the turn-based genre could pay off in a bigger way, because the amount of time put into the strategy's execution would be greater. When he had time off for paternity leave, he was told by Steely that they needed him to work on covert action so they could release some games into the marketplace. By March of 2025, the entire Civilization franchise had sold 76 million copies. It is between the 25th and 30th all-time best-selling computer or video game. Thank you for watching this Metallic Penguin documentary. May you light up the world while having a fantastic day.